welcome to Busboys and Poets Books Live. My name is Ashley Rame, Busboys and Poets Program Coordinator. I am so happy to have you here with us today. We are going to be discussing The Unbalancing with author R.B. Limberg as well. They will be in conversation with Nassim Jamnia, and we're just excited to have you here. And I am going to get right into bios, and we will bring the authors on stage and they'll get into the good stuff. So R.B. Limberg is a queer, bigender immigrant from Eastern Europe to the U.S. R.B.'s Bird verse novella, The Four Profound Weaves, was a finalist for many awards, and R.B.'s poetry memoir, Everything Falls, was published in 2022, and their stories and poems have appeared in Lightspeed Magazine's Queer Destroy Science Fiction. And as well, throughout the event, we will have their Twitter and Instagram tags so that you can follow them and keep up with their work. As well, Nassim here is a former neuroscientist and recent MFA graduate from the University of Nevada. Their work has appeared in the Washington Post, Cosmopolitan, The Rumpus, The Writers Chronicle, and other venues. They are a Persian, Chicagoan, and a child to Iranian immigrants. And Jamnia now lives in Reno with their husband, dog, and two cats. And without further ado, I am going to go ahead and bring them on.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited to be here with Nassim and to have a conversation. Thank you, Nassim.
Thank you. I'm psyched to talk about your beautiful book, The Unbalancing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for Busboys and Poets for hosting us, and for all y'all for joining us at home or in a coffee shop or otherwise. So, RB, were you gonna treat us with a reading?
Yes, I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning, and I have a bunch of coffee shop stickers in my book.
I love that.
For all the coffee lovers, of which I'm definitely one. So this was a book I had no idea that I would even finish, because I wrote the first 5,000 words of this book over and over for about a year. And then during the pandemic, early days of the pandemic in 2020, one of my closest friends, Corey, suddenly passed away. And so they really waited for this book, and they wanted me to progress beyond the 5,000 words. And so I wrote it in their honor. And I am just so excited to read it for you. And also, I'm kind of discombobulated a little bit by the fact that it seems really relevant to this moment. And in 2020, I hope that it wouldn't be. It is a book that very much fronts a catastrophe and communal response to catastrophe. It features two protagonists, and the first protagonist of this book is Erigra Lilun, and they're an autistic poet who is also a gardener. And so we begin from their perspective, and I think I'm going to read for about 5 minutes and then leave time. I know Nassim has some really amazing questions, so without further ado. Erigra Lilun. When I first came to Somebody's Hill, it was frizzed in fog, soft and wispy like ghost breath. The hill was just off the harbor to the north, down the path overlooking the sea. The islands were small enough that I thought I knew every curve and stone here, but I had never seen this place before. I stood waiting for something, I did not know what, a shimmer and an ending. But the hill continued to stand. Soon enough, the cool breeze pushed the fog aside to reveal a path leading up. Upon the bluish-green hill grew an ancient quince grove, a company of short, gnarled trees, their arms laden with spring blossom. The air was brisk that morning, and I huddled in my woolen knit vest, my skin clammy with sweat that had cooled in the wind. The boughs of the trees on the hill swayed with the motions of air, the petals rustled and clung to each other, and no other sound could be heard but my own labored breathing, harsh like words that demand to be written down right away. A poem about the deeds of creation, about the goddess bird descending towards the land with the 12 magical stars in her tail. I had forgotten to bring my notebook. I went up and up. All the fruit trees here were quince. I had seen such trees in town growing alongside the more plentiful apples and pears, but they'd all looked much younger. Here the noble quince trees stood side by side, an old guard protecting each other, still fertile, still blossoming. They did need a good pruning. Later that day I met Simberi. That was a year ago. I came here almost daily now, often with my pruning shears and my trowel stuffed in the pockets of that same woolen vest, now more tattered for the wear. But this morning there was an urgency in my step. Just before dawnbreak, the islands had quaked, knocking me right out of bed. I had been dreaming, I think, of the star of the tides, a desperate blue presence under the wave, contracting and expanding. A scream. I wasn't sure if it was me who shouted. A few books fell off the shelf. An earthenware cup of water cracked by the bedside. I barely remembered to pull on a pair of pants before running east through the streets of Gelgel. Instead of turning south towards the harbor, I headed north on the narrow, now familiar path to Sembere's hill. To the east was the angry sea, all muttering water and spittle of foam. I looked up at the grove. The trees were still standing. Now that I was here, I wanted to stay at the foot of the hill, postponing any actions or conversations, simply to listen. I heard my own strained breathing, and beyond it the sea, lapping anxiously, incessantly at the moss-laden stones below. The hill itself, in my mind, was grasped from within by the roots, the invisible, deep, endless roots of the quince trees. If the roots could speak, I would come here with my notebook and write down the words, then perform that as poetry. A small notebook was, in fact, in my pocket. I had a habit of stashing them in every piece of clothing. But I needed to check on Samberi, and so with a sigh I climbed up the hill to the grove. There was nobody there. I stood for a while, waving my arms just slightly in the air, as if I was a tree among others. The earthquake had passed, but the roots of the trees felt shaken, like limbs taken to tremor long after a heart murmur settles. Some of the branches lay broken, but most of the quince trees made it through the night unharmed. After a while I crouched. It was always such a visceral relief to touch the soil here with my fingers. I inhaled deeply, anchoring myself in the wet smell of the earth and the delicate sweet perfume of the quince. Many of the trees still held on to their blooms, defiant, like me. At last a semblance of peace settled in my body. I closed my eyes and called on the magic of my two deep names. I pronounced each deep name in my mind, first the longer, weaker two-syllable, then the stronger, single syllable, and felt them unfold like a sudden burst of a strong headache. A few moments later the pain receded, leaving behind it a feeling of heat at the crown of my head. I could now envision my deep names, two strong lights hovering just above my hair. With an effort of will, I focused my magic on the trees and traced the root's journey into the earth. Not good. The earthquake was over, but the disturbance itself continued. It came from far below the ground, from the southeastern direction. I turned that way. The curve of the hill here obscured the sea, but I knew what was there, a vast expanse of water, and in it the star of the tides, tossing and turning in its restless sleep. With my magical senses extended, I perceived the star in my mind's eye as a mass of azure, deep within the blue of the wave, a tangle of deep names as wide as the isles themselves. The star of the tides, the sputtering star, the unquiet sleeper, all the names we had given it over the last 1,000 years. The star was tethered to the archipelago, to the mother mountain at the heart of this island, our largest island, Geo. 1,000 years ago it was Samberi who had brought the star to the archipelago and cast it into the wave. You should reach out and touch the star, a familiar voice behind me said. Extend your deep names and reach. You're alive, Thingbird, I thought, or not alive, but something, not gone. I exhaled, and with that relief came well-practiced annoyance. Why must you always sneak up on me? Still crouching, I turned to face the speaker. My ancestor Semberi, or more precisely their ghost, as tattered and intricate as a latticework of foam, floated under the flowering quince tree. They did not look worse for the wear after the earthquake, and I did not care to find out what worse would look like on them. I'm just really glad you're safe. After a while, I settled on, I will not reach out. In the years since we first met, I must have refused them 60 times. The star is asleep, Sambari, and I will not bother it no more than I would disturb your own sleep. Sambari moved this way and that as if in the wind. There was no wind. You do not want to disturb the star, but it disturbs you. There's barely a year left. The islands rattle while it screams and tosses. Don't tell me you don't care, not after you ran all the way here in pajamas. These aren't. I took a look at myself, and sure, I had my day pants on, but also my sleeping top embroidered with very small cats. I opened my mouth to produce I dressed in the dark, then closed it. I squinted at Semberi's subtly quivering form through which the thickest of quince boughs were visible. You critique my dress, but you yourself were nothing but air. I'm a ghost, Semberi replied sagely. Why would I wear pajamas? Something occurred to me. Do you even sleep? No, they said. I'm sorry. They shrugged away my meaningless apology. Thank you. This is the excerpt. Went a bit longer, but
No, thank you so much for reading that. I love hearing authors read their work. And it's there's so much love and humor in the opening pages, and I thought of like 5 more questions. Like, damn it, why didn't I think of those questions earlier?
why doesn't the ghost wear pajamas? Maybe
yeah.
the most.
It's a good question. Yeah, no, and I I'm just like chuckling over that, like, oh yeah, there's moments of humor which I love, because there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this book. You know, there's a lot of really, really heavy things. Like this is not a book that you pick up and read. Actually, I guess you could read it Sunday afternoon over tea or whatever, but it's a book that really makes you think, and it really makes you feel. So yeah, so thank you for reading that for us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So I would love to open up by talking about consent, because I think it's the thing that anyone who reads this book, that's going to be their immediate thought, that this book deals very, very heavily with consent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's questions of whether the star consents to its treatment, whether Semberi consents to seeing public displays of affection, Lilun consenting to being touched. You know, but most people, when they think of consent, they really think of it in kind of a narrow, like, sexual consent, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is this sexual consent? Is this sexual violence? Stuff like that. But consent in the unbalancing is just a lot more varied than that. So I'd love if you could kind of talk to us about why it's such a central role, and, you know, that it seems like that was something that you were really thinking a lot about, and it comes through really clearly.
Thank you so much for this question. I think it's a really important question when it comes to my work and also to queer work in general. I feel like I did not have as deep and encompassing conversations about consent before I started talking to queer and trans writers who, like me, were coming from paradigm of smaller publishing or self-publishing, or, you know, trying to break up into big publishing, but also focused on just discussing the themes and the topics at which were important for us to discuss. And there was a time, and I guess this time is still ongoing, because this is kind of a repeating discussion, how obtaining verbal consent in sexual situations is a mood killer. And there's so much discussion around this, how it's like in the good old days you could just, you know, do whatever, and now you have to verbalize everything.
What a bonkers idea, though. Like,
right?
It's wild to me that, like, somebody is like, oh, this will kill the mood. Like, really?
Right?
Making sure your partner's okay is going to kill the mood? That's bonkers. Anyway, not to interrupt, but
yeah, and I've seen so many of those discussions, and people feeling that they need to justify the fact that they wrote consent into their works, into works books that featured romance, or where romance in general, or featured romantic storylines, or just featured encounters between people, writers felt the need to like justify it. And I felt that it was kind of not just a heterosexual paradigm, but also like a very patriarchal, very colonialist paradigm, where
Yeah.
you're, by default, you're not supposed to assert in consent. And so when I shifted the conversations that I was having about this topic onto queer and trans circles, I also talked a lot with folks about disability and disability justice, because this is something super important to me as a neurodivergent person who's also disabled and as an immigrant. I feel that just beyond sexual situations, people are subjected, the more marginalized they are, the more this happens. People are subjected to a lot of contact which is undesirable and consent is not obtained. So in border crossing situations, people will touch you, grab you, search you. People will treat your body as a body that is not granted even the question of consent. And often when you are asked for your consent, it's nominal. They will do it anyway for you. Then in medical situations and situations of medical access, a lot of times, be happy that you even have the access for. This is kind of the dominant approach, which I detest, and I think does a lot of wrong in the world. And consent for being touched and being manipulated in medical situations is not fully obtained. For example, it's presumed that the doctor can just do whatever they want with your body. It's presumed that the doctor does not have to explain what they're doing. And I find this extremely damaging. And I find this extremely damaging also in situations where neurodivergent people are involved and people who are traumatized are involved. And so from these many conversations that I was having, part of them with Corey, and with many other people, I came to an understanding that consent for me extends far beyond just consent for sexual contact. Obviously, it's about sexual contact too, but in the book, there's a number of characters who are asexual or on the spectrum of asexuality. There's a few demisexual characters. There's two who are sexual aromantic characters. And for Liloon, who is demisexual, touch is very fraught for them, and they're also on the spectrum, they're autistic, and so touch is very fraught for them, and they need to be warned. They need to be asked whether or not touch is okay. And for other people, it's not like that. But the baseline that is okay for everyone is a baseline that does not work for all people. It really forces the people who are not comfortable with touch, it forces them into situations where they are forced to accept social touch, even though it's uncomfortable, sometimes even painful or triggering. But they're forced to accept social touch because this is what the society does. And I think the pandemic changed this a little bit. But I remember when I went to some of my first cons and I posted, please ask me before you hug me. Because people would just fall on you.
Yeah.
People like grab your hair, like I don't get it, but it would happen. And I'm not touch averse, but I need a warning. And so I noticed that there was a lot of acceptance. Some people said, wow, you can actually ask people not to do that. I'm going to do that too. And there was some guy who just went on the screed how this request represents the worst of
course.
of course. So I think the unbalancing reflects a lot of my thinking, and I want to just extend thinking about consent beyond sexual situations. I want consent to be a thing that people think about in medical situations, where a lot of abuse happens. And I think it happens because there's so much disempowerment in medical situations. And it's under discussed in the disability community. We discuss it a lot, but I think in the culture in general, it's under discussed. It's under discussed what happens if you are in reduced state of awareness, like if you are under local anesthesia or you are even under general anesthesia. So this is under discussed, and I think it's just a lot of abuse can come out of it. Then what happens when you're a child, for example? A lot of people, until very recently, did not even stop to think that children should be taught consent via, having agency.
Mhm.
Parents giving children much more agency, and even again in medical situations giving children agency. And I'm not saying,
Mhm.
okay, so when I have these conversations, sometimes people will say, what about vaccinations? Are you, if your child says I don't want to be vaccinated, um what are you gonna do? Like, as if that undermines the need to give children more agency. If
Mhm.
that one counter argument is going to ruin the idea that children should be awarded more agency and given opportunities to consent. So all of this is in my mind, and I think that's what's reflected in the unbalancing. And I really do feel that it is a very queer approach.
Yeah, no, I love, there's so much in all of that I was like, oh, like holy crap, like yes, all of that. It's just because the children was the last thing. It's funny because a lot of people, I mean, even so my mom is an early childhood
Mhm,
education professor. She teaches
mhm,
teachers, and she has to tell them like, hey, like children also deal with mental health stuff.
yes.
Like whether or not like a children has a disability or is neurodivergent, but like children
Mhm,
deserve to be treated with autonomy, who
yes.
deserve to be treated with respect. If a child is throwing a tantrum, the answer is, the answer isn't, let me punish them. It's what's happening. Why is the child using, because this is the mode of expression, right? Like something is
Yes.
wrong. The child is distressed. Why don't we address the thing that's distressing them, right? And so I think for a lot of people, consent, you're right. Like consent is not even in the thought process when it comes like,
Mhm,
oh, go give
mhm.
grandpa a hug. Well, what if you don't want to give grandpa a hug? And it doesn't have to be anything
Exactly.
nefarious. It's just a matter of like personal comfort, or you just don't want to today, or whatever the case is.
Right.
And yeah, so I agree that this is like a very queer, very queer approach to consent. And it makes a lot of sense to me that it's rooted in disability justice. And, like, and actually my next question is kind of about medicine stuff, but before I get to that, I'm also really struck because I'm thinking a lot about ABA. So my brother has classical autism. He is non-speaking, and my parents didn't know any better. They put him through ABA when he was a child, and if you're non-speaking, it's hard for you to voice consent or not consent, right? Like
Mhm.
especially in something like ABA, which has been, like obviously not to speak over autistic people, but has been very traumatizing to autistic people. Autistic people have been very open about that trauma. Um, and so there's this added complexity of what happens when you can't verbalize, right? Or when your only verbalization is something like a tantrum, where people are like, "Oh my god, I have to stop the tantrum." Like
Mhm.
my mode is not to actually make sure that the whoever is okay. So yeah, I'm just like really struck by that. I don't know if I have anything more profound to say than that, but
Thank you for
yeah,
saying
thank you
all
for that.
that. I actually have thought about it a lot because my own child has um I hate functional labels, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to use functional labels. But my child is impacted by autism. He's autistic, and earlier in life he was not speaking, and ABA was something that was presented to me as the only thing that is going to make any difference. And very quickly, I understood that the system is torturous. It is torturous to children, and it's I couldn't do it. But for a bit, again, I didn't know any better. I was an immigrant. I had no idea what resources existed. And it eats at me that we even tried it, because it's such a it's a torturous system. It
Yeah.
is torturous to people. And when ABA was no longer a part of the equation, because just thinking about it makes me so angry. I started thinking, what is the most important thing for me to work on with my child? And I decided the most important thing, and he had some words at that point, very few words. And the most important thing for me was to make sure that he could say or signal yes and no. We worked on this for so long, and other people were saying, why do you even bother? Well, I must. This is the most important thing that
Yeah.
I need to know as a parent, yes or no. And that was life changing. Because, for example, I wouldn't even upload. I would not agree to upload his photos. A lot of parents were blogging about their disabled children for years until it became a topic of discussion, and thankfully it kind of lessened. But there was a period where parents would upload their pictures and describe their children's disability, and I I didn't want to do this to my child without his consent. And so very recently, I started posting his photos here and there on social media, but only with his consent and only when I was 100% sure that he agreed. He loves Instagram, so
I love that.
he thinks
That's so
Instagram is
sweet.
awesome. So now it's a bit different, but I think these issues are very fraught. I think tantrums are definitely a sign of distress. I
Mhm.
remember early on in life, I went into a restaurant with him, and he threw a tantrum, and people were like looking at me, discipline your child, like these terrible looks, like why are you here? And I remember I looked around, my kid was crying, and it suddenly struck me, he's crying, I would also cry. Lots of people, lots of noise. I also want to cry.
Yeah.
What are we doing here? So we went out. It's also not for me, but like over the years, I've been trained by my own family that I
Mm,
must endure these environments that
mm,
make me viscerally unwell. That I then need to recover in a dark room. I'm on my own. I'm not telling anyone that I need to be alone in a dark room
mhm.
after this because I'm so overstimulated. I'm so overwhelmed. And it occurred to me, wow, if I'm not gonna go in there, he's not gonna throw in a tantrum.
Mm.
Guess what?
Go figure.
So it really is very true that the moment we start thinking about, well, what is happening, you start understanding that it doesn't matter if a person's speaking or not. They're communicating with you.
Mhm.
They're telling you, you're distressing me.
Yeah.
Your actions distress me. I want out.
Yeah. Yeah, even the kid, again, I don't mean to go too far afield because we could go on this
Right.
forever, but I even children that are labeled like problem children, right? If you talk to them and you figure out what's bothering them, like you solve the behavioral issues, right? The things that are disrupting in class or whatever the thing. So it's really frustrating, but
Yeah, but
yeah.
a lot of this, and I'm sorry to go on and on about this, but a lot of this is not disrupting the classes. Just the education system is set
Oh,
in such a way that is
absolutely.
ruinous. Some kids just
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It is we do not live in a society that sets itself up for children to succeed in a way that makes sense, right? It's like our expectations put on children always. Um, so yeah, so it's bad. It's a bad. um, okay, but this is this is actually related because there's a conversation in the book that I was really compelled by Ranra and Liloon. They have a couple conversations, but they talk about feeling broken and getting
Mhm.
fixed and healing. And one of the things is like, oh, deep naming healing like doesn't can't necessarily like fix the mind or cure the mind, which I also find interesting. And a lot of this, the initial conversations come from Ranra's lifelong insecurity because she has an abusive mother,
Mhm.
biological mother, I should say. And so she feels broken, she feels like she needs to be fixed, especially in regards to her appearance. And then meanwhile, Loon's like, please stop. Like, you're stressing me out so much with this perspective. Which, like I have to wonder whether it's because they're autistic and that's, part of it. And I was also really struck, you have a Birdverse collection coming out, Geometries of
Mhm.
Belonging, right? Geometries
Yeah.
of Belonging. And when we did another event and you had read an excerpt of a deep name healer who's like sent to fix an autistic person. And I was really, really struck. I was like so moved by that excerpt. So I'm curious, like, are these in conversation with each other? What is kind of your thought process in going into this? Because it really, really struck me.
Thank you so much. That story, Geometries of Belonging, which is now also the title of my collection, that story has been, people have been talking about it since 2015 when it came out. And people are still talking about it. And such a gift because short stories often are very fleeting. They come out, people read them. This one was nominated for awards. I had another story that was nominated for awards. But in disability and neurodiversity community, people still read the story and recommend it, and it's
I
just
love that.
such a gift to me. It's just really struck a chore. and a chord. And I just feel that these are my themes. I want to talk about those themes, and I want to talk about them from different perspectives. But I think with Liloon, I think with Paret, who is the protagonist of Geometries of Belonging, he is a healer, and he has to contend with the fact that you can't really heal a mind. You can adjust it. You can do small adjustments over and over, and hope that while the person that you've adjusted feels better, they will work on their stuff and slowly, gradually. So it's kind of like a medication and therapy kind of combination. Medication alone is not gonna maybe solve all your issues, and therapy alone will not necessarily also solve all your issues. So that's kind of the process of mind healing. He's invented the discipline. Before him, people did
Amazing.
not know how to do it. But
An
he's
icon.
not taking any pride in it because he feels that it's not effective.
Mm.
He can't just redo a person, but he doesn't want to redo a person either. For Liloon, for them, it has to do more with society. They were very different from many other young people in the archipelago because it's a very social place. It's very gregarious. People come together constantly, parties, and Liloon, they could not do it very well.
They want to spend time in their
don't like
garden.
they like to be with trees, and they like to be with the trees, and maybe a friendly ghost, or you know
Or a grumpy ghost.
yeah, grumpy, very grumpy, friendly, maybe friendly ghost. But when they were a child, healers were called, and they explained to Liloon's three fathers that there's nothing wrong with them, and they just need some place to unwind and to not be overstimulated, and that was provided to them, and that was that. So Liloon comes from a very nourishing family environment, and they were supported in their neurodivergence, and so they feel that the way they are in the world is different from other people's, but it's them, and they don't need fixing. And this is also where a lot of autistic self advocates come from. We don't need fixing,
Yeah.
you have neurodivergence, you're different from other people, that's fine, but it's not a reason to try to get you into ABA and start, obedience training programs because
Yeah.
that's what it is basically. But at the same time, run and again, this levels of disability can be different. So some people don't come from this, and some people do come from this viewpoint. And for Randra, she was in a very different circumstance. Her mother was abusive and also had a personality disorder. And again,
That
in
explains a lot.
archipelago, sorry.
That explains a lot.
Yeah. I mean, in archipelago terms, I'm writing fantasy, so I'm not like
Yeah.
spelling. She has a diagnosis of this and this. She didn't. But it was clear for people who came to observe the situation and try to resolve it. They have a very kind of loosey-goosey structure where they try to help, and rather than be punitive. They try to resolve the situation in which one person is clearly has needs, and another person who is a child also has needs and is being in an abusive situation. And so the two were separated, but Randra's mother was not actually fixed. There's no fixing in the situation. And even today, with the knowledge that we have, personality disorders are very difficult to treat, and are notorious for giving children of parents with personality disorders a lot of problems in life. And so Randra is bitter. She's bitter because the islands are very accepting, very inclusive, very nurturing. But in her particular case, this meant that she was supported. She wasn't unsupported, but she also felt a lot of the harm was done to her specifically. And so her mother berated her appearance and undermined her leadership abilities and said a lot of very mean things, and continues to say them now that Randra is a leader of the people. Her mother still continues to say those things, and she believes them, and so she gets to say them. Freedom of speech, within that particular context. But for Randra, it's very painful. She's a grown woman, and she has a lot of ability and a lot of authority, but this one thing doesn't change, and so she's embittered, and so she's not very bitter in general, but this is a point of problem for her, that she keeps like scratching her her fingers against, like, what am I going to do with this? And so a lot of the decision that she makes in life, she thinks, well, am I doing this because of my upbringing, or am I doing this because I want to? And so it's hard for her, and so she's fixated on this idea that she can fix everything, she can make it work. If only she's brave enough, strong enough, good enough leader, good enough at bringing people together, she's gonna find a solution, she's gonna fix everything.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, for her, it's like, isn't this what a good leader is gonna do? Your roof breaks, I'm gonna find people who are gonna come and fix your roof.
Yeah.
If you can't do it on your own, no worries, we're gonna wrestle up a team of 7, we're gonna fix your roof. She's kind of like, I'm a go-getter, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna help you do it. And it's not the kind of problem that lends itself to that kind of approach. And that's where they kind of have a little bit of a clash. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no. I mean, it makes me think again of like the childhood agency thing, right? Where like as a child, what do you do when your parental figure, like literally the person that's meant to be caring for you, does the exact opposite and is like deeply harming you? So yeah, no, I definitely, that definitely makes sense. And that actually leads into a discussion about ancestry, because I think that's really interesting in this book too, right? So, we have, Ranra's mother is in the community, is like still around, but for her, she's like, my mother is the Mother Mountain. Like that is her mother. She says that very often she feels most at peace with the mountain. You mentioned that Lilun has 3 fathers, right? That Semburi is Lilun's ancestor. So, it's relationships are they're complex, right? Like even just when you're thinking about like, quote unquote, what is family? There's, the relationship with the others, the relationship with the self, there's the romantic and sexual relationships, right? And obviously I think this is like quite a queer approach to relationships, like all queer people are like, yes, family for sure. But like, I think the thing I found most compelling about this is that, it's not that Ranra doesn't have like a people support, but for her, like when she's upset, she goes to the mountain. When she needs answers, she goes to the mountain. And I found that really, really compelling, because, like so many people view nature as like inanimate or, not having that kind of reciprocal relationship. So I would love for you to talk about these relationships that are, to family, to self, to community, and what the kind of storytelling that you're telling us with that.
Thank you so much. This is such a great question. I wanted like take an hour to answer.
I want you to take an hour to answer all of these. I'm like, I want to know. I have to know.
So I'm an academic in my non-writing life, and I'm revising an article that I wrote about her flag means death. I don't know. It's a queer show. Anyway, I had the chance to reread these queer theories by Jack Halberstam and others about queer space and time, and how there's this idea that queer community is different because it's not focused on procreation, and so it's kind of like where heteronormative people are focused on procreation, children, and continuity, and all that. Queer people are not, and I find this view both correct and very deeply damaging. So it both works and doesn't work for me in a way that I think is really actually more damaging than helpful. I think it's important for me to think about how queer lineage works. And so in this book, I think a lot about how queer lineage works, because I reject the idea that queer people are not generational. The AIDS epidemic in this country, really ruined it for gay men and also for a community in general. But it's not true that there is no continuity in queer community, but it takes a different shape. So in the book, I model these relationships like I modeled them. It happens differently. For example, Semburi is ROAs, and so they didn't have children of their own body, but they adopted children, and in that way they are an ancestor, and they're a very real ancestor. They show up for some of their offspring and dislike others. And so they're there for Lilun in a very grumpy way, and they always berate them and try to teach them things and try to tell them things. And they have a real relationship. but they're not connected by blood, and I don't think it's necessary. Lilun has 3 fathers, and God knows if they're physically related to any of them. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't care. But they have 3 fathers, and their 3 fathers have retired into a small community for gay men to retire
I
into,
love
because
that.
they can do that thing in the archipelago. And so, but they come back and they visit, and they are in their life. And there are other there are other relationships, like relationship of Ranra with the mountain. Ranra feels very betrayed by her biological mother, who is still alive during the book, and who is still in her life, but there's no support forthcoming from those quarters. So Ranra feels supported by the mountain, which is a central geographical figure in the island. It's the biggest mountain. It's also a volcano, which has all kinds of issues later in the book.
Yeah.
But she goes there and she really impersonates the mountain. And I think for many people, I don't know, maybe not for everyone, but you have your trees, you have your favorite hill or your favorite outcropping or whatever. And for me, because I moved so many times, and because I'm a migrant from different countries, I feel like I lost some of the places which were really important to me when I was a child. I was born in Ukraine, and so now maybe these places don't even exist, but
Yeah.
I spent a lot of my childhood in Crimea. All the summers I spent in Crimea, and a lot of my description of the archipelago is based on my experience on the beaches of Crimea and the cities of Crimea, and what I was thinking about being in Crimea. And many of those places they're there, but they're destroyed, or they're altered tremendously by the war and by the conflict and by aggression. And so it really kind of felt really important to me to think about how ancestry can move beyond the human and onto land and onto human relationship with land, and how difficult it can be when there is no continuity in the land, either because you move away or because of a catastrophe, of ecological catastrophe, of which there are many those days, or because of war. And I often think about it as again, as an immigrant who moved so many times. And I'm now live in Kansas, and I've lived here for a while. And I meet a lot of people who've never left Kansas, or people who say, "Oh, I was in high school over there, over just around the corner, and I was swinging in that swing." I don't have these experiences, and so for me, it's really interesting, because it feels really strange and alien to me that somebody would look around the corner and here's the swing where 20 years ago you were on that swing. And I think that ancestry can mean so many different things. And so that's kind of where I went with it as well.
Yeah, I love that. I'm thinking about just like my own relationship to land and whatnot. Like we live in indigenous territory that has been taken from indigenous people, and from what I understand, and a lot of indigenous belief systems are around kind of the animate nature of nature. Like the connection to land and to water. And I'm thinking about, like these obviously arbitrary borders and stuff like that. And when you have some sort of migrant experience, so for me, my parents are immigrants. Like I've always hated calling myself Iranian American. I've always hated it, which is why in my bios it always says Persian Chicagoan, because I feel very deeply about Chicago as a city. So I think that's really, really interesting that it's not like this is an uncommon thing, right? People feel very strongly about where they're from, or there's a place that they really enjoy going. My husband's a geologist, so like for him, it's all about the rocks.
Yes,
he loves rocks,
awesome.
and has attachments to rocks. So yeah, I find that really profound, and I think it's really meaningful that Ranraz then looks to this physical location, this mountain, this volcano. And draws so much comfort from that, especially in light from the book, because at the end of the book, she doesn't, to me, come off as like embittered or like angry. I think she has such an interesting growth arc, because it's so much of it is because Lilun has helped change their perspective change her perspective from things. And I don't get the sense of like at the end feeling like, oh, now I'm no longer attached to this land. Like it doesn't feel like that. Like there's still like a love and appreciation for it. So yeah, I think that's really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
yeah,
you. I'm so
no,
glad
thank
it
you.
came across. Yeah, it was, yeah.
No, I definitely, this is, there's so much about this book that is to be savored. Like I'm really excited to reread it because I think there's so much that you don't, once you get to the end, you're like, oh, I got to go back. Like there's so much more that I kind of want to unpack. So yeah, no, so thank you. Like I think that's lovely.
Thank you so much. I'm a rereader, so I write like a rereader. I write for rereaders. You can get a lot out of it just from one read, but I also know that people enjoy rereading my books, and that's great for me as a rereader because I want that.
No, absolutely. Like it's funny because now I don't do as much rereading because I have so many books I want to read, and so much for me reading is through audiobooks. But like I think about all the rereading I did up until like 10 years ago. I love rereading. Like I want to put more time into rereading because I agree. There's just like a different way to kind of communicate with a book and with a story. So actually, I have a question, which it is related to the rereading thing, because I want to talk a little bit actually about your world building. There is, like part of this story is like Laloon's, journey with gender, finding a variation that seems, safe for them. And so much of the Four Profound Weaves is also about gender, but these are like very, very different birdverse societies. And they talk, it comes up in the Unbalancing. I was really struck by how different the societies are. So, I don't know, how long have you been writing in the birdverse at this point? Like over 7 years, right?
Yeah, about 10 years, I think, at this point. I think in the beginning I was a very slow writer because I saw myself more as a poet, and I published
You are a
lots of
poet.
poetry. And I edited a poetry magazine I co-edited with Shweta Narayan, my dear friend. And we wrote so many poems, and we published so many poems, and the work was so rich. And so prose for me was kind of like, okay, I have to write something deeper. And so I wrote short stories, and then I kind of realized I want to be in this world long term, and I shifted gears and started writing more long form, and that is more recent, I feel. But really, it's really during this time during the last maybe 3 years, 4 years, that I've been more focused on producing novels and novellas. And I still I like shorter. I have not yet published a doorstopper. Maybe I never will. I like kind of writing in different corners of the world because I like thinking about birdverse as a kind of a tapestry where each book and each story stands on its own. You don't need to read anything else to read this book. In fact, this is a great first book. If you've never read anything in birdverse, this is the book I now recommend as #1 introduction to the world. Yeah, so maybe 1 second about world building, and then we're gonna shift to questions.
Yeah.
I think that my most important desire as an author in my world building was to showcase the incredible diversity of queer experiences, both in how societies treat queer and trans people, and how queer and trans people find community with each other. And so I feel that each society does it differently, and then when they combine or people travel, that's where there's a lot of richness in it.
I love that. Yeah, I do want to definitely get to questions, but it's definitely from like the bits of birdverse that I've read so far, you definitely get that. So you're doing it. So yeah, we have a question about what you would like readers to get out of this book.
Well, I am not the kind of writer who tells readers what to get out of my books. But I think the most important thing that I hope readers take away from this is that there is incredible power in community. And that even if you are facing something really huge, like they're facing a really, global catastrophe in this book, which in the beginning they don't know yet the full extent of the kind of threat to their way of life that they're going to face. And they come together as a community, and there's a lot of power in it. Even if success is not possible or not guaranteed, the very fact that they come together as a queer community, right? But as any marginalized community, I feel very strongly about it, that there is a lot of power in it. And I think that there is an environmental message in this book, which has to do with questions about stewardship of land, and who is responsible for making sure that we still have an environment to take care of, and how out of even very, very best intentions, or very well-intentioned people who are very good people, there's still a possibility of failure. And another message in this book, it's not really a message, but just a theme that I explore, is the theme of failure. Like, I think that a lot of times science fiction, fantasy narratives make us expect success. Always. Like, failure is just a plot point to get us to success. And I wanted to rattle that. I wanted to rattle that. It's not a tragedy, but I wanted to rattle that. If only you do everything right, you cannot fail. Because that's not true. That's not how life works. So, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, we should talk about that on Wednesday.
Yes.
That's interesting. Someone else asks if the conflict in Ukraine affected the writing process for this book.
Not for this one. I wrote in 2020, so I'm obviously always immersed in what is going on in Ukraine, but not back in 2020. Publishing is very slow. Everything I've done this year has been heavily impacted by the war in Ukraine. I'm very involved with the Ukrainian poetry community. I've translated. I said I would never translate, and then, reality smacked me on the hand with that. I've translated so many just amazing poems from Ukrainian to English, and I keep doing it. I just agreed to do 3 more. I just had 3 translations come out. And so everything I've done this year has been affected by the war. I'm now writing a science fiction novella which heavily deals with some of the themes that I've processed as I was thinking about the war. But I keep thinking about how these themes are important to me. And so the theme of land is central to how Ukrainians think about themselves, and how, I was brought up, and how I'm Jewish Ukrainian. So that's complicated, more complicated. But it's just the theme of land and taking care of land. This is, for many indigenous cultures, it's really, really important. And it's certainly a cornerstone of how Ukrainians think about themselves.
That's really interesting. Actually, the next question is kind of related, whether any Ukrainian lore or mythology played in writing the book. And I guess we can kind of extend that to the Birdverse in general.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I try to rely on things that I feel that are mine, that are part of my own history, my own trajectory, my own ancestry, broadly construed. I don't know if I have any Ukrainian ethnic ancestry, but I have Jewish Ukrainian ancestry going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And I know where they're from, and I grew up in those places. And so a lot of Birdverse is Jewish, and a lot of Birdverse taps into Jewish mythology from Eastern Europe, but also beyond, and also Jewish literature and antiquity and mysticism and lore. But there is Ukrainian lore in this, and there is Slavic lore in this. There is a bird herself, the goddess of Birdverse, is connected to Ukrainian lore, because in Ukraine, birds are associated with soul and also with femininity. And so the fact that bird as a goddess is connected to Ukrainian lore, and the fact that bird comes for your soul as you die is associated with Ukrainian lore. So in that way, the very heart of Birdverse is associated with Ukrainian folklore.
I love
don't
that.
often talk about it, but it's there. It's right there. But of course, there's also Russian folklore associated with birds, and I've talked before about how the goddess bird for me is a firebird. She takes different shapes for different people,
which I love.
She's a firebird.
She's a god, like of course.
Why would you be only one kind of bird? You could be all of them, right? So I think I will continue incorporating elements of Ukrainian and Jewish Ukrainian and other Slavic folklore that I'm deeply familiar with, and I just feel that I personally like to be subtle, so I don't like hanging big giant letters. This is it, and this is that. And I appreciate when people do it, because that, I think, does very important things. But mine is more like, this is the soup of my life. These are all the folk tales and fairy tales that I've heard as a child. This is all the stuff that I learned about. This is the stuff that I saw, and this is the stuff that I got from my, research into the same stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's soup.
Well, it's kind of like I mean, in the same ways that like our identities can't be broken neatly into like, here is the trans part of me, here is the queer, like you can't do that, right? We're all intersectional by like necessity. So that's what it feels like, right? Like everything, if you can't separate out these elements, because that's life. That's like how we as humans are, right? That we are the conglomeration of everything we've experienced and where we come from, and etc. So
Yeah.
Well, we've got 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone has any last minute questions, but if not, I would love to hear about what you're working on.
Oh, great.
Unless it's like under wraps, in which case we can wrap it up now.
No, there is actually 2 novellas. One is a birdverse novella that I hope to be able to share news about very, very soon. That's already written, completely written, and has a publisher interested. So hopefully I'll get to announce it. Please, I need the thoughts so that it's all can be changed. And that one is about I have a code name for it, fish communism. Which is
amazing.
So this is about it's about amphibian people who envision themselves as fish-like and have a communist social organization. And one person from that society migrates and becomes an assassin. And
how is every part of it just getting better? That's amazing.
And when they become an assassin, they get a client who has no idea who out of 3 candidates for assassination she will choose to order to assassinate. And so this is the premise of this novella.
Amazing.
So hopefully it's gonna come out.
That's amazing. I'm crossing all fingers and toes for you.
Thank you.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you all for being with us. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, RB, and also Nasim. Thank you for being such a great moderator, and thank you as well to my guests that are still here on live with us. Thank you all for your questions, for your time. We truly appreciate you taking your time to spend your evening with Busboys and Poets Books and talk about the Unbalancing with RB Lindbergh. And again, thank you. Yes, beautiful cover. Yes, you're ready. Thank you. Thank
you so much.
Indeed. And without further ado, I'm going to say peace and love from Busboys and Poets. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Have a good night.
And RB, your answers were amazing. Like, I'm so
excited. Questions were amazing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.